Range Supervisor Gary Fulton was already shaking his head before Rebecca Kane even reached the counter. In his eyes, her petite frame and quiet demeanor were all the evidence he needed that she didn't belong at Blackstone Tactical Center, especially not anywhere near his prized Barrett .50 caliber rifles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun blazed overhead as Becca stepped through the reinforced glass doors of Blackstone Tactical Center, the state's premier long-range shooting facility. Located on the outskirts of El Paso, this wasn't your typical weekend warrior destination. This was where serious shooters came to test themselves against distances that would make most marksmen's palms sweat. The facility boasted lanes stretching out to 2,000 yards, with targets that looked like pinpricks from the firing line. Fulton stood behind the counter like a gatekeeper, his barrel chest straining against a tactical shirt adorned with patches from various firearms manufacturers. At 52, he'd built his reputation on 2 decades of running the most exclusive shooting range in the Southwest. His policy was simple. If you couldn't handle the recoil, you didn't belong here. And in his not-so-humble opinion, that eliminated 90% of the population, especially women. Help you with something? Fulton's tone carried all the warmth of a desert rattlesnake as he sized up the woman before him. Becca stood maybe 5'6" in her worn tactical boots, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore faded jeans and a plain black t-shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed military precision. To Fulton's untrained eye, she looked like another civilian who'd wandered into the wrong establishment. "I'd like to reserve time on your long-range course," Becca replied, her voice steady and measured. "Specifically, I'm interested in your Barrett platform." Fulton's eyebrows shot up and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Behind him, his loyal sidekick Brad Hutchins looked up from cleaning rifle components, a matching grin spreading across his face. Brad had been Fulton's shadow for the past 5 years, feeding off every moment of superiority his boss displayed over intimidated customers. "The Barrett," Fulton repeated, drawing out the words like he was speaking to a child. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what you're asking for. We're talking about a .5 caliber anti-material rifle, 50 BMG. This isn't some plinker you take to the local range on weekends." Brad chuckled from his workstation. "Boss, remember that guy last month? 200-pound construction worker. Thing nearly put him on his ass after one shot." Fulton nodded sagely, clearly enjoying the theater. "That's right. The Barrett M82 generates over 25 foot-pounds of recoil energy. That's more force than most people experience in their entire lives. The muzzle blast alone has been known to cause permanent hearing damage, even with protection." He leaned forward on the counter, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "Now, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but women generally lack the upper body strength and bone density to handle that kind of punishment."
Other patrons in the facility's lobby began to take notice. A group of off-duty police officers paused their conversation to watch the exchange. 2 competitive shooters loading deer into cases slowed their movements, sensing entertainment brewing. Even Amy Russo, a young specialist working behind the parts counter, glanced over with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Becca's expression didn't change. She simply reached into her back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting her credit card with practiced efficiency. "I understand the risks. I'll sign whatever waivers you require. 2 hours on the long-range course. Barrett M82A1 if available." Fulton's smirk widened. "Lady, you're not hearing me. This isn't about paperwork. This is about physics. The Barrett weighs 30 pounds empty. Add optics and a full magazine, you're looking at 35, maybe 40 pounds of precision machinery. Most women can't even shoulder it properly, let alone absorb the recoil without injury." "I've handled firearms before," Becca replied simply. "Oh, I'm sure you have." Fulton's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Let me guess, your husband took you to the range a few times? Maybe you've shot a .22 or a nice, gentle 9mm. Ma'am, there's a world of difference between plinking with a pistol and controlling a weapons system designed to disable vehicles at 1.5 miles. The small crowd in the lobby was growing. Word was spreading through the facility that Fulton was about to deliver another one of his legendary put-downs. It had become something of a spectacle over the years, watching the range supervisor systematically destroy the confidence of overconfident customers who bit off more than they could chew. Brad stood up from his workstation, wiping his hands on a rag. "Boss, maybe we should let her try. Could be educational." His tone suggested he was looking forward to witnessing a humiliation. Fulton stroked his goatee thoughtfully, clearly weighing the entertainment value against potential liability issues. The Barrett rifles were his pride and joy, custom-tuned precision instruments that he'd personally zeroed and maintained. Watching some civilians struggle with one would certainly reinforce his reputation as the guardian of serious marksmanship. "Tell you what," Fulton finally said, his decision made. "I'll make you a deal. You pay the range fee up front. That's $200 for 2 hours with the Barrett rental and ammunition. But when you can't handle it, and you won't be able to handle it, no refunds. And I want every person in this lobby to witness what happens when someone doesn't listen to the voice of experience." The challenge hung in the air like cordite smoke. Every eye in the facility was now focused on the quiet woman standing at the counter, waiting to see if she'd back down from Fulton's gauntlet. Becca nodded once, placing her credit card on the counter with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than all of Fulton's bluster. 2 hours. Barrett M82A1. As Fulton processed the payment with theatrical reluctance, none of them could have imagined that they were about to witness something that would transform not just their afternoon, but their entire understanding of what it meant to be a warrior.
Gary Fulton had built his empire on intimidation, and Blackstone Tactical Center was his kingdom. For 15 years, he'd cultivated an atmosphere where only the worthy survived, and he alone determined who deserved that designation. The walls of his facility told the story of his reign. Photographs of satisfied customers posing with smoking Barrett rifles, certificates from various shooting organizations, and a prominent display case filled with trophies from competitions where Fulton had either participated or coached the winners. The range supervisor's philosophy was simple. Shooting wasn't a hobby, it was a calling reserved for those with the proper mindset, physical capability, and, most importantly, the right chromosomes. He'd watched too many wannabe marksmen crumble under the awesome power of serious firearms to believe that precision shooting was an equal opportunity sport. In his world, respect was earned through recoil tolerance and measured in foot-pounds of energy absorbed without flinching. Brad Hutchins epitomized everything Fulton valued in an employee. At 28, Brad possessed the kind of blind loyalty that made him not just a worker, but a disciple. He'd started as a customer 5 years ago, a mediocre shot with delusions of grandeur, but his willingness to echo Fulton's every opinion and laugh at his every joke had earned him a permanent position. Brad understood the hierarchy. Fulton was the oracle of marksmanship, and everyone else was either a student or a pretender. "This is gonna be good," Brad whispered to Jimmy Torres, another range employee who was restocking ammunition behind the counter. "Remember that CrossFit chick from last month? Lasted exactly 3 shots before she started crying about the recoil bruising her shoulder." Jimmy, a former Army specialist who'd recently started working at the range, shifted uncomfortably. Unlike Brad, he'd actually served in combat and had seen enough real shooters to know that skill didn't always come in the package you'd expect. But at Blackstone, questioning Fulton's judgment was career suicide, so he kept his observations to himself. The lobby had transformed into an impromptu amphitheater. The 2 competitive shooters, Marcus Webb and Danny Price, had abandoned their gear entirely, settling into chairs with the anticipation of spectators at a gladiator match. Webb, a retired Marine who'd spent 20 years honing his craft, leaned over to Price with a knowing grin. "Fulton's about to teach another lesson," Webb muttered. "Poor girl has no idea what she's walking into." The off-duty police officers had formed their own commentary section near the coffee station. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez shook his head sympathetically as he watched Becca sign waiver after waiver. "Feel bad for her.
Someone should have warned her that this place isn't exactly beginner-friendly. Amy Russo continued stocking inventory, but her attention was completely focused on the unfolding drama. As one of only 2 women employed at Blackstone, she had experienced Fulton's condescension firsthand. Her hiring had been reluctant, the previous parts manager had quit suddenly, and she'd been the only qualified applicant available on short notice. Every day since, she'd endured subtle reminders that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Fulton finished processing the payment with exaggerated care, handling each document like a funeral director preparing final arrangements. Mrs. He glanced at the credit card. Kane, Rebecca Kane. Well, Mrs. Kane, I want to make sure you understand exactly what you're getting yourself into here. He gestured grandly toward the range beyond the lobby. That's not some county fairground out there. We've got electronic targets at distances up to 2,000 yards. The Barrett platform we'll be using fires a .5 BMG round. That's a bullet weighing over 700 grains, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic energy at the muzzle is over 13,000 foot-pounds. For perspective, that's enough force to punch through an engine block.
The crowd nodded appreciatively at Fulton's technical expertise. He'd delivered variations of this speech hundreds of times, and it never failed to impress customers with his comprehensive knowledge. The rifle itself, Fulton continued, warming to his subject, is a semi-automatic, magazine-fed weapon system originally designed for military applications. We're talking about disabling vehicles, taking out radar installations, eliminating high-value targets at extreme range. This isn't a sporting rifle. It's a tool of war. Becca listened patiently, her expression unchanged. She'd set her worn canvas bag on the floor beside her and stood with her hands clasped loosely behind her back, a posture that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with military experience, but went unnoticed by the civilians surrounding her. Now, Fulton's voice took on the tone of a professor delivering a crucial lesson. The human body simply isn't designed to absorb that kind of punishment repeatedly. Professional snipers train for years to build up the muscle memory and physical tolerance necessary to engage targets with this weapon system. Most people, and I'm not singling anyone out here, lack the core strength and skeletal density to maintain proper form through multiple engagements. Brad nodded sagely, as if he himself had personally conducted extensive research on skeletal density and its relationship to marksmanship. Plus, boss, there's the mental aspect. Some folks just freeze up when they feel that kind of power in their hands. Exactly right, Fulton agreed. Fear of recoil creates anticipation. Anticipation destroys accuracy. It's a psychological barrier that can't be overcome through wishful thinking or feminist ideology. The last comment drew chuckles from several spectators, though Amy Russo's jaw tightened noticeably. She'd heard enough of Fulton's psychological barriers lectures to know where this was heading. Jimmy Torres busied himself with inventory, but his discomfort was growing. Something about the quiet woman's demeanor reminded him of certain people he'd served with, individuals who spoke softly but carried an unmistakable aura of competence. He'd learned to recognize that particular combination of humility and confidence, but he'd never seen it questioned so publicly. Fulton pulled a clipboard thick with waivers from beneath the counter. These documents absolve Blackstone Tactical Center of any responsibility for injuries sustained during your session. And I mean any injuries. Bruised shoulders, separated joints, psychological trauma from the concussive effects of the muzzle blast. We've had people develop permanent flinches after just one experience with the Barrett. As Becca methodically signed each waiver, the anticipation in the lobby reached a peak fever. Conversations had stopped entirely. Even customers in distant parts of the facility were drifting toward the lobby, drawn by word that Fulton was about to deliver another masterclass in humility. "This is it," whispered one of the competitive shooters. "This is gonna be legendary." None of them noticed the subtle confidence in Becca's grip as she signed the final document, or the way her eyes had already begun calculating angles and distances toward the range entrance.
They were so focused on the spectacle they expected to witness that they missed the signs of what was actually about to unfold.
The procession to the long-range section of Blackstone Tactical Center resembled a medieval court heading to witness an execution. Fulton led the way with theatrical authority, his keys jangling against his tactical belt as he unlocked the reinforced door that separated the elite shooting bays from the standard rifle ranges. Behind him, Becca walked with quiet determination, her worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder. The growing crowd of spectators followed at a respectful distance, their whispered predictions creating a buzz of anticipation. Lane 12, Fulton announced, gesturing toward the far end of the facility. That's where we keep the Barrett platforms, furthest from the public areas for obvious safety reasons. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd made these decisions based on years of hard-earned wisdom. The long-range section was a cathedral to precision shooting. Massive concrete walls absorbed sound and contained the devastating muzzle blasts from the high-powered rifles. Each shooting position was equipped with adjustable rests, digital wind meters, and ballistic computers that could calculate trajectory to distances most hunters couldn't even see. Electronic targets downrange blinked like distant stars, waiting to register the impact of bullets traveling faster than the speed of sound. At Lane 12, a Barrett M82A1 rested in a custom rack like a sleeping giant. Even at rest, the weapon commanded respect. Its matte black finish seemed to absorb light, and the distinctive muzzle brake at the end of its 29-inch barrel looked like something designed to tame barely controlled explosions. The rifle's bipod legs were folded beneath the barrel, and a high-powered Schmidt and Bender scope sat mounted in precision rings above the receiver. "Behold," Fulton announced, with the reverence of a museum curator, "the Barrett M82A1, 30 pounds of American engineering excellence. This particular rifle has been responsible for confirmed hits at distances exceeding 1,800 yards in the hands of qualified operators." The crowd pressed closer, smartphones emerging to capture what they expected would be an educational disaster. Brad positioned himself where he could get the best view of both the rifle and Becca's anticipated reaction to its intimidating presence. "Now, Mrs. Kane, before we even think about loading this weapon, let's see if you can handle the basic manual of arms. The Barrett isn't like civilian hunting rifles. It requires specific techniques for safe operation." He lifted the rifle from its rack with practiced ease, though even his considerable strength was tested by the weapon's bulk. First, proper shouldering technique. The recoil pad needs to be seated firmly against your shoulder pocket. Any gap, any improper positioning, and you'll end up with a separated shoulder or worse. Fulton demonstrated the correct stance, his body language suggesting decades of experience with precision rifles. Weight distribution is critical. The rifle's center of gravity is forward of the trigger guard, so you need to maintain positive control with your support hand while your firing hand manages the trigger. He handed the unloaded rifle to Becca with the careful deliberation of someone passing a live grenade. "Go ahead. Show us how you'd shoulder this weapon." The moment of truth had arrived. Every eye in the facility focused on the petite woman as she accepted the Barrett's considerable weight. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for her to struggle, to stagger, to prove Fulton's point about physical limitations and the realities of serious marksmanship. Instead, something remarkable happened. Becca's hands found their positions on the rifle with fluid precision. Her support hand gripped the forestock with exactly the right pressure, firm enough to control the weapon, light enough to avoid inducing tremor. Her firing hand wrapped around the pistol grip with practiced ease of someone who'd performed this motion thousands of times. The rifle's butt settled into her shoulder pocket with a soft thud that spoke of muscle memory refined under pressure.
The transformation was instantaneous and unmistakable. The quiet woman who'd endured Fulton's condescension moments earlier had vanished, replaced by someone whose every movement radiated competence and control. Her stance widened slightly to accommodate the weapon's weight distribution. Her breathing pattern shifted to the slow, controlled rhythm that precision shooters developed through countless hours of training. "Trigger discipline," she murmured, almost to herself, as her index finger automatically positioned itself alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. A ripple of surprise passed through the spectators. This wasn't the awkward fumbling they'd expected. Webb, the retired Marine, straightened slightly as he recognized something familiar in Becca's handling of the weapon. Fulton's confident smirk flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Well, you've obviously handled rifles before, but knowing how to hold a weapon and actually controlling it under fire are very different things. Let's see how you manage the loading procedure." He produced a magazine loaded with 5 rounds of .50 BMG ammunition. Each cartridge was massive, nearly 6 inches long and thick as a man's thumb. The bullets themselves gleamed with copper jackets that barely contained the devastating potential within. The magazine wells into the receiver ahead of the trigger guard. But be aware, this isn't some lightweight sporting rifle. The magazine itself weighs over 2 pounds when loaded, and the insertion requires considerable force to overcome the spring tension. Becca accepted the magazine without comment. Her left hand maintained perfect control of the rifle, while her right guided the magazine toward its housing. The insertion was clean and decisive. No fumbling, no uncertainty, just practice efficiency that spoke of intimate familiarity with the weapon system. "Now," Fulton continued, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty, "charging the weapon requires pulling the operating handle with significant force. The Barrett's recoil operation means there's considerable spring tension to overcome." Without waiting for further instruction, Becca's right hand found the charging handle and drew it back with smooth authority. The mechanical action cycled with precision, chambering around with the distinctive sound of a weapon system ready for business. The silence in the shooting bay was profound. What the spectators had expected to witness, a civilian struggling with unfamiliar equipment, had been replaced by something entirely different. They were watching someone who clearly understood not just this particular rifle, but the entire philosophy of precision shooting. Jimmy Torres, watching from the back of the crowd, felt recognition dawning. He'd seen this before: the quiet confidence, the economic movements, the way someone carried themselves when they'd been trained by the best and tested under the worst conditions. Amy Russo found herself holding her breath, suddenly hoping that this quiet woman would prove every one of Fulton's assumptions wrong. But Fulton wasn't finished. If anything, Becca's competent handling had only reinforced his determination to expose what he was certain must be limitations disguised by beginner's luck.
"Handling the weapon is one thing," Fulton declared, his voice carrying a forced confidence that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "Actually controlling it under fire is something else entirely. Mrs. Kane, I'm going to start you off easy. 300 yards, stationary target. Most people find that challenging enough with the Barrett's enthusiastic recoil characteristics." The electronic target system hummed to life as Fulton programmed the parameters. At 300 yards, the target appeared as a small white square against the desert backdrop beyond the reinforced windows. For most civilian shooters, it represented a significant challenge. For someone supposedly unfamiliar with precision shooting, it should have been nearly impossible. "Now, before you take your first shot," Fulton continued, settling into his role as instructor, "let me explain what you're about to experience. The Barrett generates approximately 25 foot-pounds of recoil energy. That's roughly equivalent to being hit in the shoulder by a sledgehammer. The muzzle blast will be substantial. Even with hearing protection, you'll feel it in your chest cavity." Brad nodded enthusiastically from his position behind the firing line. "Boss, remember that big guy from Dallas? Thought he was hot stuff until the Barrett introduced him to reality." The crowd of spectators had grown to nearly 20 people. Word had spread throughout the facility that Fulton was conducting another educational session, and employees and customers alike had abandoned their activities to witness what promised to be an entertaining humiliation. Becca adjusted her position behind the rifle,
settling into the shooting rest with movements that were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as beginner's luck. Her left elbow found the perfect spot on the padded rest, creating a stable platform that would absorb and redirect the weapon's tremendous recoil. Her right hand maintained a firm but not over-tight grip on the pistol grip, while her trigger finger remained safely outside the guard until she was ready to engage. Breathing technique is crucial with the Barrett, Fulton lectured, though his audience of one seemed to already understand concepts he was explaining. The rifle's weight makes it stable, but any movement during trigger pull will send your shot wide. You need to fire during your natural respiratory pause. What happened next would be replayed on smartphone videos for weeks to come. Becca's breathing settled into the slow, controlled rhythm that marked a trained precision shooter. Her right eye aligned perfectly with the scope, and her head positioned itself at exactly the correct distance to avoid scope bite, the painful impact that occurred when inexperienced shooters held their face too close to powerful optics under recoil. Through the high magnification scope, the target at 300 yards appeared large and clear, but Becca's expression suggested she was seeing something beyond a simple paper bullseye. For just a moment, the controlled environment of Blackstone Tactical Center faded away, replaced by memories of similar crosshairs aligned on targets that meant the difference between life and death for people she'd sworn to protect. The Barrett's trigger was crisp and clean, breaking at exactly 4 pounds of pressure. When Becca squeezed it, the weapon's report was deafening, a concussive blast that rattled windows and sent a shockwave through the concrete shooting bay. The muzzle brake redirected burning gases and pressure in a pattern designed to reduce felt recoil, but the visual effect was spectacular. A massive fireball erupted from the rifle's muzzle, and the concussion was powerful enough to disturb loose papers on nearby benches. The rifle's recoil was indeed tremendous, but Becca absorbed it with textbook form. Her body rocked back slightly, then returned to perfect position and emotion so smooth it appeared choreographed. There was no flinch, no loss of control, no sign that she'd been affected by the weapon's punishing characteristics. The electronic target system processed the impact data and displayed the results on overhead monitors. A perfect X-ray hit, centered exactly in the bullseye. The silence that followed was deafening in its own way. Webb, the retired Marine, felt his assumptions crumbling. In 20 years of military service, he'd seen exactly this kind of shooting from maybe a dozen people, all of them specialists trained to impossibly high standards.
"Lucky shot," Fulton announced, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Mrs. Kane, let's see if you can repeat that performance. Lightning rarely strikes twice." Becca chambered another round with mechanical precision, her movements economical and sure. The second shot followed 30 seconds later, producing an identical muzzle blast and an identical result, another X-ring hit, this one so close to the first that the holes nearly overlapped. Jimmy Torres stepped closer to the monitors, studying the impact patterns with growing amazement. Those weren't lucky shots. They were the product of training and experience that went far beyond anything available to civilian shooters. "Interesting," Fulton said, his tone suggesting anything but genuine interest. "Two good shots, but consistency is what separates real marksmen from weekend warriors. Let's see how you handle multiple engagements under time pressure." He reprogrammed the target system to present a series of different-sized targets at varying distances, some at 300 yards, others pushed out to 500. "You'll have 60 seconds to engage 5 targets. Miss any of them, and we'll chalk this up to beginner's luck running out." Amy Russo watched from her position near the parts counter, silently willing the quiet woman to succeed. She'd endured too many of Fulton's lectures about natural limitations and proper roles to want anything other than a complete reversal of his smug expectations. The targets appeared in sequence, each visible for only seconds before disappearing. At 500 yards, they were barely visible to the naked eye, requiring not just accuracy but the ability to rapidly acquire and engage multiple points of aim under pressure. Becca's response was methodical and devastating. Each shot was deliberate, controlled, and precise.
The Barrett's massive reports echoed through the facility like artillery fire, but she rode each recoil cycle perfectly, returning to target faster than should have been possible for someone supposedly unfamiliar with the weapon system. Target 1, X-ring hit. Target 2, X-ring hit. Target 3, dead center. Target 4, perfect score. Target 5, another bullseye that left no doubt about the shooter's capabilities. When the smoke cleared, literally and figuratively, the overhead monitors displayed a perfect score. 5 targets, 5 perfect hits, accomplished in 43 seconds. The crowd stood in stunned silence, struggling to process what they'd witnessed. This wasn't luck. This wasn't beginner's fortune. This was the kind of shooting that required years of intensive training under the most demanding conditions. Fulton stared at the monitors, his face cycling through emotions ranging from disbelief to anger to something approaching panic. His entire worldview, his assumptions about physical limitations, gender roles, and natural ability was crumbling under the weight of empirical evidence he couldn't deny. That's not possible, he stammered. Nobody shoots like that without extensive training, specialized training, military training. For the first time since entering the facility, Becca spoke more than a few words. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the shooting bay. "You're right," she said simply. "Nobody does." The implication hung in the air like cordite smoke, and suddenly every person in that room began to wonder exactly who they were dealing with.
Fulton's face had transformed from its earlier confident smirk into something resembling controlled panic. The Barrett M82A1 rested in front of a woman who had just delivered shooting that would have impressed instructors at the Army's sniper school, and every assumption he'd built his reputation on was crashing down around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Military training?" he repeated, seizing on Becca's words like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "Well, that changes things considerably. Mrs. Kane, what branch of service? When did you serve? What was your MOS, your military occupational specialty?" But Becca had already returned to her previous pattern of minimal responses. She simply nodded toward the targets downrange, her meaning clear. If he wanted to continue this exhibition, they should continue shooting. The crowd of spectators had swelled to nearly 30 people. Kitchen staff had abandoned their posts, maintenance workers had materialized from back corridors, and even customers from the pistol ranges had gravitated toward the long-range section. Smartphones were recording from every angle, capturing footage that would spread across social media faster than wildfire through dry brush. Brad Hutchins whispered urgently in Fulton's ear, "Boss, maybe we should—" "No," Fulton cut him off sharply. "If Mrs. Kane wants to showcase her military training, then let's give her a real test, something that will separate the professionals from the pretenders." His voice carried across the shooting bay with renewed authority, though those paying close attention could detect the underlying desperation. Fulton's entire identity was built around being the apex predator in this environment. He couldn't simply acknowledge defeat, not in front of this crowd, not with his reputation at stake. Long-range precision shooting isn't just about hitting stationary targets. Real-world applications require adaptation to environmental factors, moving targets, and extreme distances. Mrs. Kane, let's see how your military training translates to civilian world challenges. He activated a more complex target system, one typically reserved for advanced military contractors and specialized law enforcement units. 800 yards, variable wind conditions, multiple target presentations, including simulated moving threats. This isn't basic marksmanship anymore. This is advanced tactical shooting. Amy Russo felt her heart rate increase as she watched the electronic display initialize. She'd seen Fulton use this particular program to humble experienced shooters who'd gotten too cocky. The targets would appear at unpredictable intervals, some moving laterally across the field, others popping up for just seconds before disappearing. Success required not just accuracy, but rapid target acquisition and the ability to calculate complex ballistics on the fly. Jimmy Torres stepped closer to the shooting line, his military experience allowing him to recognize what was happening. He'd seen this before, a superior officer pushing a subordinate beyond reasonable limits, driven by ego rather than training objectives. But something about Becca's demeanor suggested she wasn't intimidated by the escalation. Environmental conditions, Fulton continued, consulting a tablet that displayed real-time weather data. Wind is gusting from southwest to northeast at 12 to 15 miles per hour. Temperature is 92 degrees, humidity at 18%. At 800 yards, you'll need to compensate for bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric pressure variations. The mathematical complexity would have overwhelmed most shooters. Calculating trajectory for a .5 BMG round at that distance required understanding ballistic coefficients, air density variations, and Coriolis effect compensation. It was graduate-level marksmanship that typically took months to master. Becca adjusted the scope's elevation turret with practiced precision, making calculations that seemed to occur automatically in her head. Her movements were economical and sure, suggesting familiarity with ballistic mathematics that went beyond basic military training. The first target appeared as a fleeting shape at extreme range, visible for perhaps 3 seconds before vanishing. The Barrett's report echoed across the facility, followed immediately by the electronic tone that indicated a successful hit.
Webb, the retired Marine, found himself studying Becca with professional interest rather than casual curiosity. Her breathing patterns, her body position, even the way she worked the rifle's bolt between shots, everything indicated training at a level he'd only encountered among special operations personnel. "Lucky wind call," Fulton muttered, programming the next target sequence. "Let's see how she handles multiple movers." 3 targets began traversing the field at 800 yards, their movement patterns designed to test a shooter's ability to lead moving targets while compensating for environmental factors. The challenge was exponentially more difficult than anything typically expected of civilian marksmen. Becca's response was methodical and devastating. Each shot was precisely timed to intercept the target's movement, accounting not just for their speed, but for the bullet's flight time and wind deflection over the extended range. The electronic scoring system registered 3 consecutive hits on moving targets that most experienced shooters would have considered nearly impossible. The silence in the shooting bay was profound. Even Fulton had stopped offering commentary, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching awe mixed with growing alarm. Danny Price, one of the competitive shooters who'd initially expected entertainment at Becca's expense, leaned toward his companion. "I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, he whispered. "I've never seen anything like this outside of military demonstration teams." A new element entered the crowd dynamics. Instead of anticipating failure, the spectators began watching with the fascination of people witnessing something extraordinary. Phones continued recording, but the mood had shifted from mockery to genuine amazement. Fulton's desperation reached a new level. "Mrs. Kane, I have to ask, what unit did you serve with? Because this level of marksmanship suggests specialized training that goes well beyond standard military programs." For a moment, something flickered across Becca's features. A shadow of memory, perhaps, or recognition that her performance had crossed a line from impressive to suspicious. But she merely shrugged, her attention already returning to the rifle. "Extreme long range," Fulton announced, his voice taking on an almost manic quality. 1,000 yards, precision target, single shot opportunity. This is beyond the effective range for most military applications. Miss this shot, and we'll know exactly what your limitations are. The target appeared as barely more than a dot at the extreme end of the range. At that distance, environmental factors became critical. A slight miscalculation in wind speed or direction could send the bullet feet off target. It was the kind of shot that separated true precision marksmen from merely competent shooters. Becca settled behind the Barrett with the patience of someone who had made similar calculations under far more stressful conditions. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm that marked complete focus. Through the high-powered scope, the distant target became her entire universe.
The memories came unbidden. A rooftop in a foreign city, innocent lives hanging in the balance, a target who had to be neutralized with surgical precision, the weight of responsibility, the absolute requirement for perfection, the knowledge that failure meant consequences too terrible to contemplate. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet's flight time at that distance was over a second, an eternity for a precision shooter. When the electronic tone finally sounded, indicating a perfect center hit, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause that echoed through the concrete shooting bay like thunder. Fulton stared at the scoring monitor, his face pale with the realization that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding or ability to control.
The applause died slowly, leaving Fulton standing in a silence that felt more oppressive than any sound could have been. His kingdom, this carefully constructed realm where he reigned supreme, was crumbling around him with each perfect shot Becca fired. The Barrett M82A1 rested in front of a woman who had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. And every person in the facility knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. That was impressive, Fulton managed, his voice barely above a whisper. But then, like a cornered animal, his desperation transformed into dangerous recklessness. But Mrs. Kane, I think it's time we stopped playing games. If you're going to showcase military training in my facility, then let's see exactly what that training was worth. Brad Hutchins shifted uncomfortably behind his boss. Even his limited intelligence was sufficient to recognize that Fulton was entering territory where pride was overruling common sense. But years of enabling had created a dynamic where challenging Fulton's decisions was unthinkable. "Sir?" Jimmy Torres ventured carefully. "Maybe we should—" "No," Fulton snapped. "Mrs. Kane clearly has advanced training. Well, advanced training deserves an advanced test." His voice carried across the shooting bay with renewed authority, though those who knew him well could detect the hysteria underlying his bravado. He moved to a secured cabinet at the rear of the shooting bay, producing a key that unlocked what appeared to be specialized equipment. "Mrs. Kane, what we've done so far has been impressive target shooting. But real precision work, the kind that separates military snipers from recreational marksmen, requires operating under pressure that simulates actual combat conditions." The crowd watched with growing fascination and concern as Fulton retrieved what appeared to be a complex timer system and a series of reactive targets designed to simulate human silhouettes. The equipment bore the distinctive markings of specialized training aids used by military and law enforcement agencies. "Hostage scenario," Fulton announced, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a death sentence. "Multiple targets at varying distances, some friendly, some hostile. You'll have one opportunity to identify and neutralize the correct target while avoiding civilian casualties. Miss the hostile or hit a friendly, and you fail. This is the kind of shooting that separates weekend warriors from actual operators." Amy Russo felt her stomach drop. She'd heard whispers about Fulton's ultimate test, a scenario so challenging that it had broken the confidence of experienced military marksmen who'd made the mistake of challenging his authority. It was designed not to evaluate skill, but to ensure failure and humiliation. The targets arranged themselves at distances ranging from 600 to 1,200 yards. Some were clearly marked as hostile threats, others bore the distinctive silhouettes of noncombatants. The scenario was fiendishly complex, requiring split-second decision-making combined with impossible accuracy at extreme range. You'll have 30 seconds to identify and engage the primary target. The hostile subject is holding a weapon trained on a civilian. Miss him, and the innocent dies. Hit the wrong target, and you've committed murder. This is the kind of pressure that actual snipers work under, where failure isn't just disappointing, it's catastrophic. Webb, the retired Marine, stepped forward with alarm. "Fulton, this is insane. That's not a test. It's a sadistic game designed to separate reality from fantasy," Fulton cut him off. "Mrs. Kane has demonstrated impressive marksmanship. Now let's see if she has the psychological fortitude that real military work demands."
For the first time since entering the facility, Becca hesitated. Her hands remained steady on the Barrett, but something in her expression suggested that Fulton's scenario had touched on memories she'd spent considerable effort trying to forget. The crowd sensed the shift in atmosphere. What had begun as entertainment had evolved into something darker, a psychological confrontation that went beyond simple marksmanship. Even the most bloodthirsty spectators began to feel uncomfortable with the direction events were taking.
Of course, Fulton continued with sadistic pleasure, if you'd prefer to acknowledge that your earlier performance was the result of favorable conditions and beginner's luck, we can end this demonstration now. No shame in recognizing your limitations. The challenge hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Fulton had trapped Becca in a scenario where backing down would invalidate everything she'd accomplished, but proceeding meant engaging with a test designed specifically to break her composure and confidence. Becca's breathing had changed. Instead of the controlled rhythm of precision shooting, it had become shallow and rapid. Her eyes, which had been focused and clear throughout the earlier challenges, now carried a distant quality that suggested she was seeing something beyond the present moment. Jimmy Torres recognized the signs immediately. He'd seen that expression on the faces of soldiers who'd been pushed beyond their psychological limits, the 1,000-yard stare that indicated someone was reliving trauma rather than existing in the present moment. "Ma'am," he called out, breaking protocol by addressing her directly. "You don't have to do this. You've already proven—" "She has to do this," Fulton interrupted viciously, "if she wants to claim any credibility for her performance today. Real operators don't get to choose their scenarios based on comfort level." The targets were now active, their electronic systems programmed to simulate the kind of high-stress decision-making that had defined the worst moments of Becca's military career. In the distance, silhouettes moved unpredictably, some clearly hostile, others representing innocent lives that hung in the balance. But something remarkable happened as Becca settled behind the Barrett. Instead of the psychological breakdown Fulton expected, her demeanor shifted into something that made every veteran in the room take an involuntary step backward. Her breathing stabilized into the deep, controlled pattern of someone entering a combat mindset. Her grip on the rifle adjusted slightly, taking on the relaxed competence of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure. Most telling, her eyes cleared completely, focusing with the intensity of someone whose training had been forged in situations where failure meant consequences too terrible to contemplate. "Time starts now," Fulton announced, activating the scenario with malicious satisfaction. The targets began their programmed movements, a complex dance of threatening and innocent figures that required instant identification and surgical precision. At extreme range, with multiple moving elements, the scenario would have challenged the most experienced military marksman. Becca's response was immediate and devastating. Her scope swept across the field, identifying threats and non-combatants with the speed of someone whose survival had once depended on making such distinctions under fire. When she found her target, a hostile figure with a weapon trained on a civilian silhouette at over 800 yards, her decision was instant. The Barrett's report echoed across the facility with finality. Through the high-powered spotting scopes, observers watched the designated hostile target drop while the civilian remained untouched. The electronic system registered a perfect score, threat neutralized, no civilian casualties, time elapsed 4 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Fulton stood frozen, staring at the scoring display with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been obliterated. Because what they'd witnessed wasn't just exceptional marksmanship. It was the kind of shooting that indicated training and experience at the very highest levels of military specialization, the kind of precision that was whispered about in classified briefings and commemorated in operations that would never appear in public records. Becca slowly lowered the Barrett, her hands rock steady, despite having just navigated the most psychologically demanding challenge Fulton could devise.
When she looked up at the crowd of stunned spectators, there was something in her eyes that made it clear she'd done this before, not as a training exercise, but in situations where lives actually hung in the balance.
The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Webb, the retired Marine, broke it with a whisper that carried across the shooting bay like a gunshot. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, staring at Becca with dawning recognition. "I know who you are." Every head in the facility turned toward him, but Webb's eyes remained locked on Becca, his expression cycling through disbelief, awe, and something approaching reverence. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of someone who had just recognized a legend walking among mortals. "Operation Steel Rain," he said quietly. "Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. 3 years ago." He paused, swallowing hard. "You're Rebecca Kane. You're the sniper who saved those hostages." The effect of his words was electric. Several veterans in the crowd straightened as if called to attention, while others pulled out phones to frantically search for information they'd heard whispered in military circles but never fully believed. Amy Russo felt her heart stop. Operation Steel Rain wasn't just military history, it was legend. The kind of story that circulated through special operations communities in hushed tones, growing more incredible with each telling until it seemed too extraordinary to be true. 18 hostages, Webb continued, his voice gaining strength as memory filled in the details. American contractors and Afghan civilians held by Taliban extremists in a compound outside Kandahar. Hostage rescue teams couldn't get close, too much open ground, too well defended. Command was ready to write them off as acceptable losses. Fulton stood frozen, his earlier arrogance replaced by dawning horror as he began to understand exactly whom he'd been tormenting for the past hour. But someone, one sniper, took a position on a ridge 1,200 meters away. Impossible range for hostage rescue work. One mistake, 1 millimeter off, and innocent people die. The Taliban had guns to their heads, using them as human shields. Jimmy Torres stepped closer, his own military experience allowing him to fill in details that civilian observers couldn't grasp. 1,200 meters, he repeated quietly. That's not just long-range shooting, that's beyond the effective range of most military sniper systems. At that distance, you're dealing with bullet drop measured in feet, wind drift that can push rounds yards off target. 6 shots, Webb said, his voice filled with professional awe. 6 Taliban fighters, 6 headshots, 1,200 meters out. Perfect surgical precision, with hostages literally inches away from each target. The rescue team said when they reached the compound, some of the hostages didn't even know their captors were dead. The shooting was so precise, they never heard the gunshots. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the full implications sunk in. They weren't dealing with someone who'd served in the military. They were in the presence of someone whose actions had become the stuff of legend among the world's most elite warriors. The Army tried to classify the whole operation, Webb continued. Too sensitive, too politically complicated. But word gets out in the community. Special Forces instructors use it as an example of what's theoretically possible with perfect training and perfect execution. Most people figured it was just a story, something too incredible to be real. Becca's expression hadn't changed throughout Webb's recitation, but something in her posture suggested resignation rather than pride. She'd spent 3 years trying to disappear from public attention, hoping that the memories and the recognition would fade into military folklore. "Ma'am," Jimmy Torres said, quietly, his voice carrying the respect reserved for someone who had operated at levels he could barely comprehend. "That operation, they said the sniper took fire during the engagement, that she was wounded but kept shooting until every hostage was safe."
For the first time since entering Blackstone Tactical Center, Becca spoke more than a few words. Her voice was steady but carried undertones of weariness that suggested the cost of that legendary precision. "Shrapnel from a mortar round," she said simply. "Caught fragments in my left leg during the 3rd shot. Had to adjust my position and continue the mission." She paused, her gaze distant. 18 people were depending on perfect execution. Personal comfort wasn't a factor. The crowd absorbed this information in stunned silence. They'd been expecting to witness the humiliation of an overconfident civilian. Instead, they'd watched one of the most lethal precision shooters in military history demonstrate why legends become legends. Fulton's face had drained of all color. His earlier condescension and sadistic challenges suddenly appeared not just inappropriate, but potentially dangerous. He was dealing with someone whose lethal capabilities were literally the subject of classified military briefings. "The leg injury," Amy Russo said quietly, pieces falling into place. That's why you're not active duty anymore." Becca nodded once. "Medical discharge. Nerve damage from the shrapnel makes extended operations difficult. The Army decided I was more valuable as a training instructor than a field operator." Her expression carried a hint of bitter irony. "Turns out, teaching others to shoot is less fulfilling than they advertised." Danny Price, the competitive shooter who'd initially expected entertainment, found himself studying Becca with the fascination of someone meeting a living legend. "Ma'am, the shooting today, this was just casual demonstration for you, wasn't it? You were holding back." A ghost of a smile crossed Becca's features. Mr. Fulton's challenges were less demanding than operational requirements. The implications hung in the air like cordite smoke. Everything they'd witnessed, the impossible precision, the calm under pressure, the surgical accuracy that had left them speechless, represented Becca operating at perhaps 50% of her actual capabilities. Webb stepped forward, extending his hand with the formal respect of one professional warrior acknowledging another. "Ma'am, it's been an honor. What you did in Afghanistan, what you've done here today, it reminds people like us why we served." Other veterans in the crowd began approaching, offering quiet words of respect and gratitude. They understood in ways that civilians couldn't the dedication and sacrifice required to achieve what Becca had accomplished. Meanwhile, Fulton stood isolated in his humiliation, suddenly understanding that his afternoon of expected entertainment had transformed into public recognition of his complete inadequacy as a judge of military capability. The woman he'd tried to humiliate was quite literally one of the most dangerous precision shooters on the planet, someone whose actions had saved lives and become the gold standard for what was possible when training, dedication, and raw talent converged under impossible pressure. And now, everyone in his facility knew exactly how badly he'd misjudged the quiet woman who'd simply wanted to do some shooting on a Tuesday afternoon. The aftermath of revelation unfolded with the swift brutality of a controlled demolition. Within minutes of Webb's identification, the atmosphere at Blackstone Tactical Center had transformed from spectacle to reckoning, and Gary Fulton found himself standing in the ruins of his carefully constructed authority. The first domino fell when Marcus Webb pulled out his phone and placed a call that everyone could overhear. "Colonel Harrison, it's Webb. You need to know that Rebecca Kane, yes, that Rebecca Kane, just gave a demonstration at a civilian range in El Paso. The range supervisor spent an hour trying to humiliate her before realizing who he was dealing with." Even from across the shooting bay, the explosive response from Webb's phone was audible. Colonel Harrison's voice carried the fury of someone who understood the political and professional implications of a decorated war hero being mistreated by a civilian contractor. Amy Russo watched with fascination as the power dynamics in the room shifted like tectonic plates. Fulton, who minutes earlier had been the undisputed authority figure, now stood isolated and defenseless as the full weight of his mistakes crashed down upon him. "Sir," Jimmy Torres said quietly, approaching Becca with the respectful deference he'd never shown Fulton, despite years of employment. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone here who served, I want to apologize for what happened today. This isn't how we treat heroes." His words carried particular weight because everyone knew Jimmy had been complicit in Fulton's behavior through his silence. But faced with genuine military greatness, his priorities had clarified with startling speed. Becca accepted his apology with a nod, but her attention was focused on something more concerning than personal slights. "Specialist Torres, how often does this facility conduct evaluations like the one Mr. Fulton subjected me to today?"
The question hung in the air with the weight of a criminal indictment. Jimmy's face paled as he realized the implications, not just for today's incident, but for every veteran who'd been subjected to Fulton's sadistic testing over the years. Ma'am, it happens more often than it should. Mr. Fulton has certain opinions about who belongs on this range. I see. Becca's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. And how many of those evaluations involved veterans dealing with service-related injuries or psychological trauma? The silence that followed was damning. Everyone present understood that they'd witnessed not just today's humiliation, but the exposure of a systematic pattern of abuse directed at the very people who deserved the most support. Danny Price stepped forward, his competitive shooter's perspective adding another dimension to the developing crisis. Ma'am, if I may, there are sponsors and military contractors who use this facility for evaluations and training. If word gets out about how veterans are treated here... He didn't need to finish the sentence. In an era of heightened awareness about veteran welfare and PTSD treatment, the revelation that a prominent shooting facility had been systematically humiliating disabled service members would be catastrophic for business relationships and public reputation. Brad Hutchins, reading the writing on the wall with the survival instincts of a career sycophant, began distancing himself from his boss with pathetic desperation. I always thought the evaluations were too harsh. I tried to tell Mr. Fulton that we should be more supportive of our veteran customers. The blatant revisionism drew disgusted looks from everyone who'd witnessed his enthusiastic participation in Fulton's earlier performance, but nobody bothered to correct him. They had bigger concerns than Brad's attempt at self-preservation. Amy Russo seized the moment with the courage of someone who'd finally found an opportunity to speak truth to power. Ma'am, if you're interested in seeing changes here, I have documentation of customer complaints going back 2 years, veterans who reported feeling unwelcome, people who canceled memberships after being subjected to Mr. Fulton's evaluations.
Her offer carried the weight of evidence that could transform the current incident from an isolated mistake into a documented pattern of institutional misconduct. Webb ended his phone call and approached the group with the expression of someone delivering both good and bad news. Colonel Harrison is en route. He's bringing the base commander and a representative from Veteran Affairs. Mrs. Kane, they want to discuss not just today's incident, but the broader issues with veteran treatment at civilian facilities. Fulton finally found his voice, though it emerged as a desperate plea rather than authoritative command. Now, wait just a minute. This is my facility. I've been running successful operations here for 15 years. One misunderstanding doesn't invalidate 15 years of misunderstandings, Becca interrupted quietly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 15 years of using your position to systematically discourage veterans from accessing recreational shooting opportunities, 15 years of turning what should be therapeutic activity into psychological warfare. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood both the technical aspects of marksmanship training and the broader implications for veteran welfare. This wasn't just about shooting. It was about providing safe spaces for people dealing with service-related trauma. Jimmy Torres stepped forward with the resolve of someone who'd finally found the courage to do the right thing. Ma'am, I'd like to volunteer to assist with any investigation or reform efforts. I've been complicit in the situation too long, and I want to help make things right. The offer of cooperation from an employee insider represented the death knell for Fulton's position. With employee testimony, customer complaints, and high-level military attention converging on his operations, his authority was evaporating like morning mist in the desert sun. Furthermore, Becca continued, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to strategic planning, I suspect this facility has been missing opportunities to serve the veteran community in positive ways. Specialized programs for service members dealing with PTSD, adaptive training for disabled veterans, partnerships with veteran service organizations. Amy Russo's eyes lit up with possibilities she'd never been permitted to explore under Fulton's management. Ma'am, I've actually researched adaptive shooting programs. There are techniques and equipment modifications that can help veterans with various disabilities maintain their marksmanship skills. Excellent, Becca replied, with the first genuine smile she had shown since entering the facility. That's exactly the kind of thinking this place needs. As the conversation shifted toward constructive solutions, Fulton found himself increasingly marginalized, a spectator to discussions about the future of his own facility. The empire he had built on intimidation and exclusion was being redesigned around inclusion and support, with his input neither requested nor welcome. The transformation was remarkable in its speed and thoroughness. What had begun as an afternoon of expected entertainment had evolved into a comprehensive reckoning with institutional culture, and everyone present understood that Blackstone Tactical Center would never be the same. More importantly, they understood that change was not just inevitable, but desperately overdue.
6 months after the incident that would become known in veteran circles as the Reckoning at Blackstone, the facility bore little resemblance to Gary Fulton's former kingdom. The transformation had been swift, comprehensive, and remarkably effective, turning what had been an exclusionary bastion into a model for veteran-inclusive recreational shooting. Amy Russo stood behind her new desk, not the cramped parts counter where she'd once hidden from Fulton's condescension, but a spacious office with a nameplate reading Director of Veteran Services. The promotion had come 3 weeks after Fulton's termination, along with authority to implement the programs she'd dreamed about but never been permitted to develop. "Mrs. Kane," she said into her phone, reviewing the week's schedule on her computer screen, "we have 17 veterans signed up for Thursday's adaptive shooting workshop, including 3 Purple Heart recipients and 2 Medal of Honor winners who heard about the program through word of mouth." Becca's voice came through the speaker with the warm authority that had become familiar to everyone associated with the facility's transformation. "Excellent! Has Specialist Torres finished the equipment modifications for the veteran with the prosthetic arm?" "Completed yesterday," Amy replied with satisfaction. "Jimmy designed a custom grip system that allows full Barrett operation with one functional arm. The veteran tested it successfully at 600 yards. The conversation represented everything that had changed at Blackstone. Where Fulton had once focused on exclusion and limitations, the new leadership emphasized adaptation and possibility. Jimmy Torres, promoted to Chief Range Safety Officer, had proven remarkably gifted at developing equipment modifications that allowed disabled veterans to participate fully in precision shooting activities. "How's the PTSD support group developing?" Becca asked, referring to another innovation that would have been unthinkable under the previous management. "Better than we hoped," Amy reported. "Dr. Martinez says the combination of precision shooting and peer support is producing remarkable therapeutic results. Veterans who haven't been able to sleep through the night in years are reporting significant improvement after just a few sessions." The success wasn't accidental. Becca had leveraged her military connections to bring in Dr. Elena Martinez, a specialist in combat trauma, who understood both the therapeutic potential of marksmanship training and the specific needs of veterans dealing with service-related psychological injuries. Through the window, Amy could see the outdoor ranges where another revolution was taking place, where Fulton had once hosted ego-driven competitions designed to humiliate weaker shooters. Blackstone now featured collaborative training sessions where expert marksmen mentored veterans struggling to rebuild confidence shattered by combat experiences. "Mrs. Kane," Amy continued, "we've received another inquiry from a facility in Colorado. They want to implement our veteran support model at their range." The replication of Blackstone's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Within months, shooting facilities across the Southwest were requesting consultation on developing veteran-inclusive programs. Becca had become an unofficial ambassador for adaptive shooting, traveling to ranges and military installations to share the lessons learned from Fulton's downfall. "Schedule them for next month, but make sure they understand that this isn't just about adding programs, it's about fundamentally changing facility culture. Half measures don't work."
The distinction was crucial. Amy had witnessed enough superficial attempts at veteran outreach to recognize that true transformation required more than good intentions. It demanded systematic changes in staff training, facility policies, and most importantly, leadership attitudes towards service members dealing with invisible wounds. A knock on her office door interrupted the conversation. Connor Blake, a young Army veteran who'd started as a participant in the PTSD support group and gradually evolved into an informal peer counselor, entered with a report that brought a smile to Amy's face. "Ma'am," Connor said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that marked successful recovery from combat trauma. The new veteran who started last week just achieved his first bullseye at 400 yards. He's been dealing with hand tremors since his IED incident, but the breathing techniques Mrs. Kane taught him are really working. These were the moments that made all the transformation worthwhile. Veterans who'd been written off as too damaged for precision shooting were discovering that their military training, properly supported and adapted, remained their greatest strength rather than a source of painful memories. "Any word from Colonel Harrison about the congressional visit?" Amy asked, referring to the upcoming inspection that would determine whether Blackstone's model would be recommended for nationwide implementation. "Confirmed for next Friday. 3 senators and 2 representatives, plus staff from the Veterans Affairs Committee. Mrs. Kane will be conducting the briefing." The political attention was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. What had begun as one veteran's refusal to accept condescension had evolved into a case study for veteran services reform at the federal level. Amy's phone buzzed with a text message that brought another smile to her face. It was from Danny Price, the competitive shooter who had witnessed Becca's original demonstration. His message was brief but meaningful. 6 more ranges in Texas just committed to implementing your veteran programs. The revolution is spreading. The revolution had indeed become a movement. Shooting facilities across the country were discovering that veteran-inclusive policies didn't just serve a moral imperative, they made excellent business sense. Veterans represented a significant and underserved market, and facilities that welcomed them with appropriate support programs were seeing substantial increases in membership and revenue. More importantly, the transformation had created a network of mutual support that extended far beyond marksmanship training. Veterans who'd found community at Blackstone were staying in touch, supporting each other through crises, celebrating successes, and building the kinds of bonds that had once seemed lost forever. "Mrs. Kane," Amy said, returning to their phone conversation, "I have a question that's been bothering me. Why did you agree to help us transform this place? After what Fulton put you through, you could have just walked away and let the facility fail." There was a pause before Becca responded, and when she did, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd thought deeply about responsibility and service. "Amy, 18 people are alive today because I was in the right place with the right skills when they needed help. But those skills are meaningless if we don't use them to build something better for the people who come after us." The answer encapsulated everything that had changed at Blackstone. Under Fulton's leadership, the facility had been about proving superiority and excluding those deemed unworthy. Under the new paradigm, it was about service, support, and the recognition that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. As Amy ended the call and returned to her work, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. A single afternoon of witnessed courage had sparked changes that would benefit veterans for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with one person refusing to accept no as an answer.
2 years after the incident that transformed American Veteran Services, Rebecca Kane stood on the observation deck of what was now officially known as the Blackstone Veterans Memorial Shooting Center, watching a scene that would have been unimaginable under Gary Fulton's reign of intimidation. Below her, lanes that had once hosted ego-driven competitions now featured collaborative training sessions where Purple Heart recipients mentored young veterans struggling with invisible wounds. The Barrett M82A1 that had served as Fulton's weapon of humiliation was now part of an adaptive shooting program that had restored confidence to hundreds of service members who'd been told their military careers were permanently over. "Ma'am," Connor Blake said, joining her on the observation platform. The congressional delegation just finished their final interviews, Senator Rodriguez wants to speak with you before they head back to Washington. Connor's transformation from traumatized veteran to program coordinator represented everything that had changed at Blackstone. The young soldier who'd once struggled with hand tremors and night terrors was now leading workshops that helped other veterans reclaim their sense of purpose and competence. How did the delegation react to the success metrics? Becca asked, though she already knew the answer from the expressions she'd observed during the morning briefings. They were stunned, Connor replied with obvious satisfaction. 93% reduction in veteran suicide rates among program participants, 78% improvement in PTSD symptoms, and complete elimination of shooting-related accidents despite tripled facility usage. The statistics represented more than policy success. They represented lives saved, families preserved, and potential unleashed. What had begun as one woman's refusal to accept condescension had evolved into a national model for veteran rehabilitation that was being replicated at facilities across the country. Amy Russo emerged from the elevator, her tablet displaying the latest program metrics that had impressed the congressional visitors. As Director of Veterans Services, she'd overseen the expansion from a single facility to a network of 37 locations across 12 states, each implementing the inclusive principles that had emerged from Fulton's downfall. "Mrs. Kane," Amy said, "I have news that I think you'll find interesting. The Department of Veterans Affairs just approved our proposal for a national certification program. Starting next year, any shooting facility that wants to receive federal Veterans Services funding will have to complete our sensitivity training and adapt to shooting workshops." The announcement represented the final victory in a war that had begun with condescension and evolved into comprehensive reform. Fulton's model of exclusion and humiliation was being systematically replaced by a philosophy of support and adaptation that would benefit veterans for generations to come. "There's more," Amy continued with barely contained excitement. "The Medal of Honor Society wants to present you with their Distinguished Service Award for your work in veteran rehabilitation. The ceremony will be at the Pentagon next month." Becca accepted the news with the same quiet grace she'd shown throughout the transformation process. Public recognition had never been her motivation, but she understood that visibility for the program meant resources for the veterans who needed support. Through the observation windows, she could see Jimmy Torres working with a veteran who lost both legs to an IED explosion. The adaptive shooting platform Jimmy had designed allowed the veteran to operate a Barrett rifle from his wheelchair, and his groupings at 600 yards would have impressed professional marksmen. More importantly, his smile was genuine, the expression of someone who'd rediscovered that disability didn't mean incapability.
"Ma'am," Connor said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you. That day with Fulton, when you could have just walked away after proving your point, what made you decide to fight for all of us?" The question brought back memories of that pivotal afternoon when condescension had transformed into revelation. Becca remembered the crowd of spectators expecting entertainment, Fulton's sadistic challenges, and her own decision to turn humiliation into opportunity for positive change. "Connor," she replied thoughtfully, "Operation Steel Rain taught me that precision shooting isn't just about hitting targets. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. When I saw how veterans were being treated here, I realized that the mission hadn't ended with my medical discharge. It had just changed venues." The answer encapsulated the philosophy that had driven every reform, every program expansion, and every battle with bureaucrats who preferred the status quo to meaningful change. Service wasn't about personal recognition. It was about using whatever skills and resources you possessed to make life better for those who came after you. A commotion near the facility entrance caught their attention. A van had arrived bearing the logo of a local news station, followed by 2 more vehicles carrying what appeared to be a film crew. Amy checked your tablet and smiled. "The documentary crew. They're here to film the final interviews for their piece on veteran rehabilitation programs. The producer says it's going to air during prime time on Veterans Day." The media attention represented both opportunity and responsibility. Every story about Blackstone's transformation reached veterans who might benefit from similar programs, but it also attracted scrutiny from critics who questioned whether the changes were sustainable or merely cosmetic. "Mrs. Kane?" a new voice called from behind them.
They turned to see Dr. Martinez, the trauma specialist whose therapeutic innovations had become integral to Blackstone's success. I wanted to update you on our latest research results. The peer-reviewed study on precision shooting as PTSD therapy has been accepted for publication in the Journal of Military Medicine. The academic validation was crucial for expanding the program beyond enthusiastic testimonials to evidence-based policy recommendations. When congressional committees and VA administrators saw peer-reviewed research demonstrating measurable improvements in veteran mental health, funding decisions became much easier to justify. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranges, Becca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been a retired sniper dealing with her own service-related injuries and seeking nothing more than a quiet place to maintain her marksmanship skills. But sometimes, destiny arrived disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons, and sometimes the most important battles were fought not with Barrett rifles at extreme range, but with patience, persistence, and the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. "Ma'am," Connor said, checking his watch, "the congressional delegation is ready for your final briefing. Senator Rodriguez specifically wants to discuss nationwide implementation of the adaptive shooting programs." Becca nodded, gathering her thoughts for what might be the most important presentation of her military career. The skills that had once saved 18 hostages in Afghanistan were now being used to save hundreds of veterans from despair, addiction, and suicide. The mission continued. The targets had simply changed, and the precision required was no less demanding than anything she had faced in combat. But surrounded by the evidence of transformation, veterans laughing, learning, and rediscovering their strength, she knew that every challenge had been worth the effort. As they headed toward the briefing room where senators waited to hear about revolutionary approaches to veteran care, Becca smiled at the irony. Gary Fulton had tried to prove that some people didn't belong in his exclusive domain. Instead, he'd helped create something far better, a place where everyone belonged, everyone had value, and everyone deserved the chance to aim higher than they ever thought possible.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.